Hi, Miss Nikki here. Welcome back to part 2 of tissues. We're going to talk about connective tissue, and we're going to talk about muscle, and we're going to talk about nerve or nervous tissue. So again, we're focusing on what does it look like, what's its function, and where do you find it. First, we have to talk about some general characteristics of connective tissue. So when we talked about epithelial, remember we said there wasn't a lot of space. The cells were closely packed together. There was an apical side and there was a basement membrane side. With connective tissue, you're going to see that most cells are not in direct contact with each other. There's lots of space. So you might see a cell here and a cell here and a cell there and a cell there. And you're going to see some proteins. So you're going to see collagen fibers running through and elastic fibers running through. And then you're also going to have blood vessels. So on top of all of these different cells and protein types, you're going to have blood vessels. So what I like to think of connective tissue as cells with space between. Now, this isn't always the rule. We'll see some dense connective tissue where the cells are packed together. But for the most part, if you see a bunch of cells and there's space in between them, it's probably connective tissue, with the exception of nervous tissue. Some of the characteristics of these protein fibers that you're going to find. So remember, we're going to have cells and we're going to have proteins. We're also going to have a substance which we call ground substance. It's kind of like a background jelly-like substance. So I want you to think real quick before we talk about these proteins, think about how these proteins got outside of the cell. So remember we had our cell and we said DNA copies to RNA, which copies to a protein. And then remember we learned about exocytosis. So could I build a protein inside of a cell and could I ship that protein outside of the cell? Hopefully we're all going, yes, right? Okay, so there's different types of fibers that were made by cells, and we'll get to that in just a second. But there's collagen fibers. You're going to see these in tendons and ligaments. So tendons are muscle to bone, ligaments are bone to bone attachments. You're going to see reticular fibers. These are, they basically form a framework. That's probably the best way to think about it. Framework or scaffolding or a mattress. These reticular fibers you're going to see in lymph nodes. And if you remember in chapter 1 when we talked about the lymphatic and immune system, we said that in your lymph nodes you kind of have a house for immune cells, so white blood cells or macrophages. And then we have elastic fibers. So elastic fibers are kind of just like elastic that you would have in clothing. But the part that we really need to focus on, a lot of people, if I said, what's great about elastic, you would say it stretches. And that is a good characteristic of an elastic fiber, but the fact that it recoils back to its natural shape is what's really important for us and function. So imagine your skin. If I pulled on your skin and stretched your skin out, it's great that it's stretchy, but if I let go, it should snap back to its original location, right? So the recoil part is just as important as the stretchy part. So ground substance comes in many different consistencies. I know I said jelly-like, right? But depending on the type of connective tissue, these are all connective tissue categories: blood, cartilage, bone. So depending, the ground substance can be liquid, it can be semi-solid, or it can be a solid. So think about bones. Your bones are solid, right? We take this ground substance and we're going to calcify it. We're going to take calcium and we're going to mineralize it and make the ground substance hard, and that gives your bones stability and hardness and structure. So the ground substance and the protein fibers that we just talked about, that's all called extracellular matrix. Nice figure from your book showing you that there are cells, right? So this is a macrophage. It's going to ingest pathogens, break them up into small pieces and spit them out for waste production. We have here adipose tissue. These are fat cells. You're going to have fibers, so you have collagen fibers, you have reticular fibers, you have elastic fibers. In come the blood cells, right? So we have blood vessels that are coming in here. And then this background substance, this is all ground substance that we just talked about. So you can see there's a lot more space, right? Another thing that's different between connective and epithelial tissue, you should right away see blood vessels. So is this tissue avascular, not vascular, or is it vascular? So all connective tissue, with the exception of cartilage, is vascular. And that's an important note to make when we get to cartilage. We'll talk about it. So you cannot just say all connective tissue is vascular. You have to say connective tissue is vascular except for cartilage, which is avascular. We have to talk about some of the functions of connective tissue. Remember when we talked about like the general functions of epithelial tissue, we said absorption, secretion, protection. You can see this list is a little bit longer, and we're going to talk about each tissue type and know specifically what its function is. But I just wanted you to see that connective tissue can offer protection. It can store items like fat and adipose. Connective tissue can transport items. Your blood is actually connective tissue. Again, you're going to have immune cells in your blood. Also, we're going to talk about reticular connective tissue, which acts as a framework for immune cells. And then you're going to see the binding of structures. So we're going to talk about ligaments and tendons and joint capsules. All of that is connective tissue. This nice figure about tissue classification, you can see that all connective tissue originates from a common origin, these mesenchymal cells. Then we have what we call connective tissue proper, and then we have supporting connective tissue, and then we have connective tissue that's fluid or moves. So in the loose connective tissue, we're going to see areolar, we're going to see adipose, reticular. In the dense connective tissue, we're going to see dense regular, dense irregular, and elastic. Then we're going to see cartilage, and we're going to talk about 3 different types: hyaline, fibrocartilage, elastic. Then we're going to look at bone, and we're going to talk about compact and spongy. And then we're going to look at blood. We really will wait to talk more about lymphatic fluid and the lymphatic system when we get to 202. It'll become more evident when we see the pictures, but when I say loose connective tissue, you should see white space, right? You should see spaces between the cells and the fibers. And in that white space is ground substance, some sort of fluid. But when you're looking at the slide under the microscope, you would see a lot of white background space, but there would be ground substance there if it was in the body. So then there's these 3 types that we're going to look at each one separately. So the first type of loose connective tissue we're going to talk about is areolar connective tissue, and this is really important because it makes up your skin. So when we get to the skin chapter, we're going to talk about the epithelial cells on the top, right? And so that's your closely packed cells. And then you're going to see connective tissue underneath, and it's going to have all of these fibers running through it. And you can see here collagen fibers, elastic fibers. You're going to have a lot of space that's going to be filled with ground substance. And then if you remember, you're also going to have blood vessels. So I kind of showed this image a little earlier. So blood vessels can come into this space, and the blood vessels can feed these cells in this tissue. And then remember that the nutrients can diffuse across the epithelial cell membrane and feed those cells. So remember, epithelial is avascular. I'm skipping letters. And then connective tissue, this areolar connective tissue is going to be vascular. If you want to memorize these highly, mostly, these adjectives here, you can. For right now, I just want to make sure that you understand connective tissue is vascular. Here we have adipose connective tissue. Most people would call this fat, right? So adipose connective tissue has cells in it that are called adipocytes. There's different types of fat. We can store white fat, brown fat. And basically you can enlarge these cells by storing more fat in them, or they can shrink. And it looks a little deceiving here. There are spaces. So again, you're going to have blood vessel, and you are going to have some spaces in here. So it's not as closely packed as epithelial tissue. Reticular connective tissue is this meshwork of a bunch of different fibers. So reticular fibers, leukocytes, you might know them as white blood cells. So basically, reticular connective tissue is going to make up the framework for lymphatic organs like the spleen, the lymph nodes, the thymus, bone marrow, and then it's going to provide a location for immune cells like leukocytes to kind of wander or bind to, kind of wait out for some pathogen to cross its path, and then it can pounce on it. This term I haven't covered yet, fibroblasts, blast, make. So this is a cell that makes what? Fibers. Yay! So this group, dense connective tissue, is going to have lots of fibers. And you're going to see those fibers kind of stack up, and that's where we get this term dense from. So you're going to have dense regular, dense irregular, and elastic connective tissue. They all have lots of collagen fibers. So there's more collagen fibers in dense connective tissue than there is in loose connective tissue. Collagen is also the predominant or the most abundant protein in the human body. So most people would say something like hemoglobin because we think of all the red blood cells that we have, but collagen is the most predominant protein in a human body. Dense, regular connective tissue, you can see from this image, is made up of many, many parallel collagen fibers, and they're kind of stacked. Some people say like noodles, right? There's not a lot of space here. There are few blood vessels, but there are still blood vessels. So this is vascular tissue. It takes a long time to heal because the blood has to diffuse any nutrients into the tissue. So it's kind of hard to see here, but they're trying to show you a muscle attached to a bone. And here's the tendon. So muscles are going to contract and become smaller, and that's going to pull on the tendon. And then the muscles are going to relax, and that's going to add slack to the tendon. But do you see how the stress is always in one direction? It's either coming in or going out. It's not twisting or turning, right? So dense regular connective tissue is, if you're applying stress in a single direction, you're going to see this dense regular connective tissue with lots of collagen. Now we get to look at dense irregular, and you can see here that there's still collagen fibers, but you see how they form kind of bundles, and they're kind of running every which way, right? You see a little bit more ground substance. You see this white space a little bit more clearly. This is still vascular tissue because it's connective tissue, and all connective tissue is vascular except for cartilage, which is avascular. So you're going to see clumps of collagen fibers, and they're running in all directions. This is going to provide support, resistance to stress in multiple directions. So come down here and look at when they talk about where you would find these. So the covering of cartilage, right? The covering of nerves, organ capsules. So when I think about this tissue, I usually think about joint cavities. I think about areas where, like, you might have to plant your foot, but then you're going to spin in the opposite direction. You have to have tissue that gives you that flexibility, that allows you to put stress on that area in multiple directions. And now we have elastic connective tissue. So you can see there's white space here, so there is some ground substance that's visible, but you still see a lot of fibers, right? A lot of closely packed fibers. Although this time we're going to see more elastic fibers. So densely packed elastic fibers, and remember what's great about elastic tissue, not only does it stretch, but it recoils. You're going to find this in large arteries like your aorta, your trachea, your vocal cords. So here they're showing you in the aorta. Remember, blood is going to be pumped from the heart into the aorta. That's your oxygenated blood, and then that aorta is going to fill, and it's going to push blood to the rest of the body. Well, then that aorta has to contract a little bit. So the recoil of the aorta is due to the fact that we have lots of elastic fibers and that vessel has lots of elastic connective tissue. Now we move on to supporting connective tissue. We're going to talk about cartilage and bone. Remember, cartilage is avascular. It's the only connective tissue that does not have its own blood supply. Bone is vascular. Okay, so cartilage, it's going to have a semi-solid extracellular matrix. You're going to have lots of collagen, lots of elastic fibers. You're going to have mature cartilage cells. They're called chondrocytes. So site, cell, chondro means cartilage. You're also going to see cartilage is surrounded by perichondrium, which is a dense, irregular connective tissue. So sometimes you can have multiple tissue layers in an area. Cartilage is pretty strong. It is flexible. Areas of the body that need support, but also have to be flexible, right? Have to be able to be moved around or withstand changes. Remember, avascular, 3 types: hyaline cartilage, fibrocartilage, elastic cartilage. Be very careful. We have 2 types. We have elastic connective tissue. That was the aorta that we saw, right? And we have elastic cartilage, cartilage, let me get it out, connective tissue. You can see how we got one word difference in here. So just pay attention as we move through these, that there's elastic connective tissue and there's elastic cartilage, which is still under the category of connective tissue. The first type of cartilage we're going to talk about is hyaline cartilage. It is the most common type. It kind of looks clear or glassy in appearance. It's going to be surrounded by the perichondrium, which is that dense, irregular connective tissue. Probably the best examples of where you're going to see hyaline cartilage is going to be the ends of long bones, the costal cartilage, right, that separate your ribs from your sternum or your breastbone. We'll also see it in the nose, the trachea, the larynx, but this is kind of what we're going to come back and talk about when we talk about bones, that if you have a long bone, it's going to have a cap or an end, and they call it an articular end of a long bone, and it's going to have hyaline cartilage. It's going to allow for smoother movements. Fibrocartilage is the second type of cartilage we're going to talk about. This is weight bearing. So you're going to find this menisci or meniscus of the knee. So between your femur and your tibia, you have this fibrocartilage. And this is the impact from running, right? All that is going to go here to the fibrocartilage. So this is weight-bearing cartilage. It resists compression. You also find it between your vertebral discs, which they have here. So if you hear somebody that says, I slipped a disc, they're talking about fibrocartilage. And then pubic symphysis is between the hip bones. So when you're walking, the hips are kind of alternating, and you have that cushion in between your 2 hip bones to stop them from smashing into each other when they come back. So something to look at, we still have lots of collagen fibers here, right? It's just we have a real thick arrangement of them. If you remember, hyaline cartilage looked kind of glassy. It still had collagen fibers. There just weren't as many of them. So now that we can see in this image, there are lots of collagen fibers, and that's what gives it the weight-bearing or compression resistance. I've had somebody tell me fibrocartilage reminds them of those gel insoles that you put in your shoes. So it's a little bit flexible, but it's also really thick and kind of hard on the ends. And so that's what's going to help resist compression. Elastic cartilage is the last type of connective tissue cartilage we get to talk about. It's very flexible and springy. So a lot of packed elastic fibers, and they show you a great example here with your external ear. So the ability for you to pull on your ear, to flip your ear down, to let it go, and it snaps back into place, it's because of elastic cartilage. So bone is a connective tissue. It's more solid than cartilage, but it gives greater support. So remember, cartilage we kept saying is kind of this semi-solid. Well, now we're going to talk about bone, which is solid, and as you become more solid, you have greater support, but you have less flexibility. We're going to talk about bones in much more detail when we get to the bone chapter, but there are organic or living components, and then there are inorganic. So the living components, the collagen fibers, we're going to see sugar proteins. The inorganic components, you could think minerals, right? You're going to have calcium, and they say calcium salts because it's hydroxyapatite, which is a calcium phosphate. So bone cells are called osteocytes. So osteo is kind of that term, bone, site, cell. We're going to talk about two different types. We have compact bone and spongy bone. We have two types of bone to look at here. We have compact bone and spongy bone. And I love this when they name things, very clear what they look like. Compact bone, it's very compacted. It's very strong. It has these cylindrical structures called osteons. We're going to talk more about bone when we get to the bone chapter. Spongy bone looks just like that. It looks spongy. It has little holes in it. It's more of a lattice work structure. It's still strong, but it's lightweight, and you're going to find spongy bone on the inside. So basically our bones are covered with compact bone, but then inside they're lighter and they have more spongy bone. Here they're showing the compact bone. You can see those cylindrical structures I was talking about, osteons, and that they're packed really tight together and they're going to harden. So this would be compact, hard bone. It's hard to see over here, but they're trying to show you right here is the compact bone. And then all of this, we'll see a better image when we get to bone chapter. All of that would be spongy. So the inside of your bone is made up of spongy bone, the outside is made up of compact bone. Lots of bone functions here. I would think about each one of these and see if they make sense to you, not just memorizing the list. So levers for movement. Remember, your muscles are attached to the bone. So if the muscle contracts, it's going to pull on the bone, and that's what allows us to pick up our leg and move forward, right? Bones act as a support for other tissues, and one of them you could say would be muscles. It protects vital organs. So you know that your brain is encased in skull, right? That the rib cage is encasing the heart and the lungs, the vital organs, right? And then you have vertebrae, and vertebrae are protecting the spine. So anytime you see bone wrapped around a particular structure, then you should know that that's a pretty vital organ. I've talked a little bit about the minerals that are stored in bones, the calcium and the phosphorus or the hydroxyapatite. This is what makes bones strong, but it's also a storage tank. So if we needed calcium for something, which you'll find out later we need for lots of things, if we needed calcium, we could take it out of our bones. And then we have hemipoietic tissue, which is going to make blood cells. So when I say making blood cells, I'm talking about white blood cells, I'm talking about red blood cells, also platelets. So if you've heard of red bone marrow, so this is kind of the area we're talking about. You have specific areas inside of bones that house the stem cells that allow you to replenish the cells in your blood. Next, we talk about the fluid connective tissue. We have blood. It's going to have formed elements. You can think of that as cells. We're going to have erythrocytes. These are red blood cells. We have leukocytes. Those are white blood cells. And then you're going to have cellular fragments called platelets. These are going to help with clotting. A lot of this information we're not going to cover again until we get to 202, but you should realize that blood is a type of connective tissue and that it's going to have proteins in it. It's going to have cells in it. And it's going to carry all of our nutrients, our waste, and our hormones. Remember when we talked about endocrine glands? They secrete hormones into our bloodstream. Lymphatic tissue, again, we're not really going to talk about until we get to 202. Lymphatic tissue is filled with lymphatic fluid, and we get this lymph from our blood plasma. So lymph is basically any leftover fluid that doesn't make it back into your bloodstream. It travels in the lymphatic vessels, gets cleaned, and then eventually gets returned back into your bloodstream. Nice image from your book of what a blood slide would look like. So we can see here the red blood cells. And then here with a nucleus, the purple, we can see white blood cells. These are going to fight infection. Remember, erythrocytes are going to carry oxygen. White blood cells, I just said, are immune cells. They're going to fight infection. And it's really interesting because you can take just one drop of blood and you can put it on a slide and you can smear it over the slide and then you can stain it and you would see thousands of red blood cells. So I think sometimes we don't appreciate that we have millions and millions of red blood cells floating in our bloodstream that are carrying oxygen to our different tissues in order to undergo cellular respiration and make ATP so that the body can do work. Third category we have is muscle tissue. So remember epithelial and connective tissue, we're on muscle. And then the last one we're going to talk about is nerve or nervous tissue. So muscle tissue, the cells of the tissue are going to contract when stimulated. So when the brain tells the muscle to contract, it will. This contraction causes movement. And there's three different types here. So we have skeletal. This is muscle that's attached to bone. So think about physical movement, like moving yourself, right? Cardiac is going to be muscle of the heart, and the heart moves blood. And then we have smooth, and I'm going to say this is any hollow tube. If you need to transport a liquid through a hollow tube, you're going to see smooth muscle. So this would be blood vessels. This could be esophagus. This could be your intestines, right? So any hollow tube that you're going to move a liquid through or semi-solid pieces through, you're going to see smooth muscle. Some characteristics of skeletal muscle, they are voluntary. What does voluntary mean? Does not contract until stimulated by the nervous system. Somatic means body, nervous system. So you voluntarily, your brain has to say, I want to pick up my arm. And then you're going to contract those skeletal muscles in order for you to pick up your arm. You're going to see long cylindrical cells, and you're going to see them arranged in bundles. They're also multinucleated. So that means they have multiple nuclei. This tissue is vascular, all of it. So you always have to have a blood supply to all of your muscle. Nice image here of skeletal muscle. So you're going to have fibers that are running through, and these fibers, some of them are really thick, and then they have sections that are really thin, and so it causes these lines or striations to form. Also, they have multiple nuclei. Normally, when you do mitosis, you have one cell and it copies itself, and now you have two. With skeletal muscle, when they undergo mitosis, you have one cell, it's going to copy itself, but it doesn't split. It doesn't do that cytokinesis where it splits the cell. So you'll have one nucleus here and you'll have one nucleus here. But again, skeletal muscle is going to be filled with these myofilaments or muscle filament proteins. Cardiac muscle tissue is going to be in the wall of the heart. It's responsible for heart contraction to pump the blood. You're going to see one, maybe two nuclei. You're not going to have multinucleated cells. You're going to see these intercalated discs that allow cardiac cells to talk to each other. Remember when we talked about gap junctions between cells? That's what this is, those gap communication junctions. And then something to point out is cardiac muscle is involuntary. It's not controlled by your voluntary nervous system. What this means is your brain and certain cells within the heart are taking care of making the heart contract. So this is something that you don't have to actively worry about. Your brain is taking care of it for you. And I usually tell people, can you imagine if every second of your day you had to say, contract, okay, contract again, okay, now contract. If you were responsible for the consciousness of your heart contracting, it'd be hard for you to do a lot of other activities. So this is kind of going on behind the scenes. Your brain and the cells within your heart are taking care of making the heart contract on schedule. You can see this tissue looks much different. You can still see some striations, but not as pronounced as with skeletal. And you see these intercalated discs right here. And so those are the gap junctions so that the heart cells can kind of spread the message and they can all contract at one time. So you want the heart to contract all at one time to push the blood up and out. Now, last, we have smooth muscle. It is involuntary muscle as well. Again, your brain doesn't tell food to move from one section of your small intestine to another where you're consciously aware of it. That would take up way too much time, right? So this is happening again behind the scenes. Your brain is orchestrating it, but you're not conscious of what your brain is telling the muscle to do. So they're lack striations, appear smooth. That's why it's called smooth muscle. They're more of kind of a spindle-shaped cell, and they're found in the wall of the intestines, the stomach, airways, bladders, blood vessels. You can see that this is any hollow structure or tube, it's going to have smooth muscle. And it's going to help propel movement of some substance through these organelles. It could be air, but the majority of the time, if you look at these, it's some sort of fluid or semi-solid, right? We have food particles with water in the stomach and stomach acid. Blood vessels, we have blood with water, which is plasma. So there's no voluntary control over these muscles. We can see here a smooth muscle example from the textbook, and you can see it does look smooth. There's no striations. This is what they mean by that kind of fusiform cell. To me, they kind of look like squamous shaped. And where do you find them? The walls of hollow organs. And what do? They move and propel material through a hollow tube. Go back and review voluntary. This is something that students kind of get stuck on sometimes. Go back and review voluntary and involuntary. So remember, voluntary is skeletal. Skeletal muscle is voluntary, which means I can control it. I can tell it to go, like to contract and move, or I can tell that muscle to not contract. I can inhibit that muscle. Involuntary is both your cardiac and your smooth. You cannot inhibit this. If I said, heart, stop right now, that's not going to work, right? My brain is behind the scenes telling my heart and my smooth muscle to contract. I have no control over what's happening to those tissues. So nervous tissue, yay, we're on the last one. So nerve tissue or nervous tissue is located brain, spinal cord, and nerves. So nerves would come out of the spinal cord or out of the brain. We have cranial nerves and spinal nerves. The cells that make up nervous tissue are called neurons. And then we also have some helper cells. We'll see these glial cells. They do not send signals, but they're kind of helper cells. They support the neurons. Here's a nervous tissue, and here's an example of a neuron, which is the cell that makes up nervous tissue. So you can see there's one neuron here, and there's another neuron here, and then those little spots in the background, those are all the little helper cells, the glial cells. So they do want you to understand kind of what the shape of a neuron is. So neurons make up nervous tissue. Neurons have a cell body, or kind of this core section. They're going to have dendrites. These can receive signals. And then they're going to have this tail, which is an axon used to transmit signals. So you could have a stimulus bind to the dendrite. That would send a signal through the soma, down the axon to the end of the neuron, and then the signal could continue through the neuron to another neuron. So this is how we get messages all the way from our brain to our big toe. Just to drive the point home, when we talk about organs, remember organs are the next level up from tissues. So remember, cells compose tissues, different tissues compose organs. So an organ is two or more tissue types together, and they're working to perform a specific function. This is a nice image for you to see how multiple tissues come together to help an organ fulfill its function. You can see they've color-coded the four major tissue types and then where they're located within the organ, the stomach. So we know we take food in, right? Food goes from our mouth to our esophagus to our stomach. We break the food down, and then the particles are sent to the intestines for us to absorb the nutrients. You can see here on this top layer, you're going to have simple columnar epithelium. You're going to have connective tissue, which is offering kind of a supporting role to this epithelium. You're also going to see gastric glands, and those gastric glands are formed from invaginations of epithelial tissue. And those glands, let's say they could release hydrochloric acid to help you break down food, and the release from those glands is controlled by nerve endings. So we wouldn't want to release hydrochloric acid into our stomach if we didn't have any food in our stomach, right? You can also see here we've got a smooth muscle layer. So not only are we putting hydrochloric acid on the food, but we're also churning the food. So we need these muscles to move so that the stomach is churning and breaking the food particles apart while we're putting hydrochloric acid on them. So you can see that there's lots of different tissue types, but they're all contributing in some fashion to the organ's specific function. We need to talk about body membranes just a little bit. So this is formed from an epithelial layer, and it's always going to have connective tissue underneath. It's going to line the body cavities, or it's going to cover organs, or it can make up your external body surface. So cutaneous is skin. Synovial is found in joint cavities. We've talked about serous membranes, right? We talked about pericardial. We had visceral, and we had parietal membranes, right? Visceral, parietal, pericardium, visceral, and parietal, pleura, right? And then we have mucous membranes. So you're going to see these, any that produce mucus, digestive tract, urinary tract. Okay, last thing I want to talk about is organizing all this material. It is really hard to go through the book and go through the PowerPoint and take all your notes and try to keep everything organized. So I highly suggest you do some sort of chart, and I have one for you inside the unit, the lab material for this unit. So go look at it, print it out, fill it out. I think it's a good way to organize the information. You can also do an outline if you like that version better, but you can see that the tissue is listed here, and then I'm saying tell me what it looks like, tell me where you find it, tell me the function, and then tell me whether it's vascular or avascular. All of the tissues are innervated. All of the tissues have nerve tissue in them, right? So really you just got to keep the vascular and avascular straight. So this is the epithelial tissue, I got muscular, nervous, and then on the second page it's a list of all the connective tissue. So I think it'll be helpful. I've had students use it in the past and really like it. This is one of the things that students usually fill out and keep. When they go on to other programs, they like to use it as a reference source. So hopefully this will help you. I guess I'll see you next video. Bye.